The thing about isolation is that it changes the way you hear. Every creak becomes a footstep. Every branch against the window becomes fingers tapping glass. I learned this the hard way in January of 2019 when I rented a cabin in the Monongahela National Forest of West Virginia, 63 miles from the nearest town and far enough from cell service that my phone became nothing more than an expensive flashlight. I was 28 years old, going through what my therapist called a transitional period following my divorce, and I thought solitude would heal me. I thought wrong. Before we begin, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to like the video and share it with your close friends and family. I would also love to hear where you are listening from. Thank you all for the support. It truly means a lot to me. Now, let's start. The cabin belonged to a family friend who'd inherited it from his grandfather, a man who'd built the structure himself in 1952 and lived there alone until his death in 2001. It was modest by any standard: 2 rooms, a wood-burning stove, an outhouse 30 feet from the back door, and windows so old the glass had begun to warp, making the forest beyond shimmer like a fever dream. The nearest neighbor was a hunting lodge 7 miles north, closed for the season. The nearest road was a dirt path that became impassable after snowfall, which is exactly what happened 2 days after I arrived. The first 3 nights passed without incident. I read by lantern light, cooked beans and rice on the wood stove, and took long walks through the frozen forest during daylight hours. The silence was overwhelming at first, almost oppressive, but I grew to appreciate it. There's a certain peace in hearing nothing but your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the gentle pop of firewood settling into ash. On the 4th night, that peace shattered. I was reading a collection of Appalachian folklore ironic, given what followed when I heard the first knock. 3 deliberate strikes against the front door, spaced exactly 2 seconds apart. I remember looking at my watch, 11:47 p.m. I set down my book and listened, convinced I'd imagined it. The cabin groaned in the wind, as old structures do, and I almost returned to my reading when it came again. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same interval. I approached the door slowly, my socked feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the warped window beside the frame, I could see nothing but darkness and the vague suggestion of snow-covered trees. No porch light. Of course, the cabin had no electricity. I grabbed the lantern from the table and held it toward the glass, but the light only reflected my own pale face back at me, wide-eyed and frightened. "Hello?" I called, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" Silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional, as though something is actively choosing not to respond. I didn't open the door. Something in my chest, some primitive instinct buried beneath years of civilization, told me that opening that door would be the last mistake I ever made. Instead, I returned to my chair, kept the lantern burning bright, and fed the stove until the fire roared. I told myself it was the wind, a branch, an animal, anything but what my gut knew it to be. At 2:13 a.m., the knocking returned. This time it came from the bedroom window. 3 knocks. Same rhythm, same interval. I didn't move. I sat in that chair, with my back pressed against the wall, watching the bedroom doorway as though something might emerge from the shadows within. The cabin was approximately 400 square feet, and I had never felt more trapped in my life. The bedroom window faced the rear of the property, toward the outhouse and the forests beyond. There was no path there, no reason for anyone to approach from that direction unless they had circled the entire cabin through waist-deep snow. The knocking stopped, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe it was over. Then I heard something that still wakes me in the middle of the night, years later. Footsteps on the roof. Not the skittering of a squirrel or raccoon, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. Like someone walking slowly from one end to the other. They stopped directly above my head. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my grandfather's hunting knife across my lap, feeding the fire until dawn painted the windows gray. When light finally filled the cabin, I forced myself to open the front door and look outside. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks of any kind. Just an unbroken white expanse in every direction. I checked the roof from every angle, looking for branch marks or animal signs, anything that could explain what I'd heard. There was nothing. That afternoon, I packed my bag and started the 7-mile walk to the hunting lodge, hoping someone there could help me get my car unstuck. The lodge was locked, dark, clearly abandoned for winter. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On the front door of the lodge, someone had carved 3 vertical lines, and beneath them, in what looked like dried blood but might have been rust, were the words, "IT learns your rhythm." I walked the remaining 21 miles to the main road. A trucker found me stumbling along the shoulder near midnight, half frozen and barely coherent. I never returned from my car, my belongings, or my sanity. Some nights, when the house is quiet and sleep won't come, I still hear those 3 knocks echoing in my memory, and I wonder if I had opened that door, would whatever stood on the other side have learned my rhythm too. My wife and I thought we'd found paradise. It was October of 2021, and after 18 months of pandemic isolation in our cramped Brooklyn apartment, we'd pooled our savings and rented a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina for an entire month. The listing described it as rustic luxury, which turned out to mean running water, a generator for electricity, and a view so beautiful it hurt. The nearest town was Asheville, 45 minutes of winding mountain roads. To the east, our closest neighbors, according to the property owner, were a retired couple who lived in a farmhouse about 3 miles down the mountain and mostly kept to themselves. We arrived on a Tuesday, unpacked the car, and spent our first evening on the wraparound porch, drinking wine and watching the sunset paint the ridges in shades of amber and violet. My wife, Sarah, fell asleep against my shoulder, and I remember thinking that this was exactly what we needed. A reset, a return to simplicity. The farmhouse was visible from our porch, just barely a tiny rectangle of white against the green and gold of the autumn forest. That first evening, I saw lights in its windows, a thin curl of smoke from its chimney. Normal signs of habitation, normal signs of life. On our 3rd night, I woke to Sarah shaking my arm. Her face, illuminated by the moonlight streaming through our bedroom window, was pale with confusion. "There are people outside," she whispered, "in the yard." I sat up slowly, carefully, and looked through the window. At first I saw nothing but shadows, the skeletal silhouettes of bare trees against the star-filled sky. Then my eyes adjusted, and I understood why Sarah had woken me. Standing at the edge of our property line, perhaps 30 feet from the cabin, was a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl, both young, maybe 8 or 10 years old. They stood perfectly still, facing our cabin, their bodies arranged in a neat row like figures in a photograph. They weren't moving, they weren't speaking. They were simply standing there, watching. "What do they want?" Sarah breathed. "I don't know." I reached for my phone, forgetting that we had no service this far up the mountain. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. I tried to make out their features, but the distance and the darkness made it impossible. They were just shapes, outlines, the suggestion of people rather than people themselves. Should we, should we go out there? Sarah asked. Maybe they're lost? Maybe they need help? Something in me recoiled at the suggestion. The way they stood so perfectly still, so eerily patient, felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Normal people don't stand motionless in someone's yard at 3 in the morning. Normal people knock on doors, call out for assistance, make themselves known. No, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. We stay inside. We watched them. For what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Then, without warning or apparent cause, they turned in unison, not one by one, but all 4 bodies rotating at the exact same moment, and walked back into the forest. Their movements were strange, mechanical, like marionettes operated by a single puppeteer. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the property, looking for footprints, broken branches, any evidence of their presence. The ground near where they'd stood was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding impressions. It was completely smooth, untouched, as though no one had ever stood there at all. I decided to visit our neighbors, the retired couple in the farmhouse, to ask if they knew anything about the family we'd seen. The walk took about 40 minutes, and as I approached the property, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The farmhouse, which had shown lights and smoke just 3 nights ago, now looked abandoned. The windows were dark and filmed with dust. The chimney was cold. The front porch was covered in dead leaves that hadn't been cleared in weeks, maybe months. I knocked anyway. No answer. I peered through a window and saw furniture covered in white sheets, a calendar on the wall still showing March 2019. This house had been empty for years. I practically ran back to our cabin. When I told Sarah what I'd found, she immediately began packing. We were gone within the hour, loading our car with shaking hands, while constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of the family. It wasn't until we were driving back through Asheville that I realized what had been bothering me about them, beyond the obvious impossibility of their presence. The clothing they'd worn, the man's brown suit, the woman's floral dress, the children's formal attire, wasn't modern. It was old-fashioned, the kind of thing you'd see in photographs from the 1940s or 1950 South. I spent weeks after our return researching the property, the farmhouse, the history of that mountain. I found a newspaper article from 1953 buried in a regional archive. A family of 4, father, mother, son, daughter, had disappeared from their farmhouse during a winter storm. No bodies were ever recovered. No explanation was ever found. The family's surname was listed in the article, and when I checked it against the property records for the farmhouse, it matched. They had lived in that house. They had vanished from it, and somehow 70 years later, they were still there. Still watching, still waiting for something I pray I never understand. December in eastern Kentucky is a special kind of cold, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you forget that warmth was ever real. I was working as a traveling nurse at the time, picking up contracts at rural hospitals that couldn't keep permanent staff. The pay was good, the hours were brutal, and the accommodations were whatever I could find within driving distance of my assignment. That December, whatever I could find turned out to be a 1-room cabin on the property of a man named Earl Hoskins, who charged $200 a month and asked no questions. The cabin was ancient, probably older than Earl himself, with walls so thin I could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the timber. There was a wood-burning stove for heat, a well pump for water, and an extension cord running from Earl's house a quarter-mile away for electricity. One outlet, one bare bulb, one room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen combined. The bathroom was an outhouse behind the structure, and I learned quickly to limit my water intake after sunset to avoid midnight trips through the freezing dark. The first 2 weeks passed uneventfully. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital in Hazard, came home exhausted, and slept like the dead until my alarm dragged me back to consciousness. Earl checked on me once, bringing a casserole his wife had made and warning me about the ice on the hill, which could make the dirt road treacherous. He seemed like a decent man, quiet and weathered by decades of mountain living. It was during my 3rd week, on a night off when the temperature dropped to -15, that I noticed the breath on my window. I was reading in bed, wrapped in every blanket I owned, when I glanced at the window and saw the condensation. It's a circle of fog on the glass, about the size of a face, slowly fading as I watched. I stared at it, confused. The stove was burning hot, and yes, there would be condensation from the temperature difference, but this was on the outside of the window, as though someone had pressed their face against the glass and breathed on it. I got up, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and approached the window. The fog was nearly gone now, just a faint outline remaining. I cupped my hands against the glass and peered out into the darkness. Nothing, just black trees against a blacker sky, and the distant glow of Earl's porch light, impossibly far away. I returned to bed, unsettled, but not frightened. Not yet. The next night, it happened again. This time I was awake, sitting at my small table eating leftover hospital cafeteria food. When I saw the fog appear on the window, I watched it form, watched it hold its shape for several seconds, watched it fade. My heart began to pound. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door, throwing it open before I could convince myself not to. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath and burning my exposed skin. I swept the flashlight beam across the area around my cabin, across the bare trees and the frozen ground and the darkness that seemed to swallow the light before it could travel more than a few feet. No one was there. I examined the snow beneath my window the next morning. No footprints, no disturbances of any kind, just smooth, unbroken white. The 3rd night, I set up a kind of trap. I placed empty soup cans on my windowsill inside, and out reasoning that, if anyone approached the Arabida window, they would knock them over and alert me. I stayed awake, watching, waiting. At 2:33 a.m., I saw the fog appear on the glass. The cans didn't move. Nothing touched them. But there it was, that circle of condensation, that unmistakable evidence of breath against the window. I should have left then. I know that now. But the hospital needed me, and the roads were treacherous, and I convinced myself that there had to be an explanation. A draft from inside the cabin, somehow. A quirk of the temperature differential. Anything but what I was increasingly afraid it might be. On the 4th night, the fog appeared in the shape of words. I watched, paralyzed, as letters formed in the condensation. Slowly, deliberately, as though traced by an invisible finger. 2 words that I will never forget as long as I live. Stay Warmy was gone before dawn, leaving behind half my belongings and all of my deposit. I drove straight to Earl's house and pounded on his door until he answered, bleary-eyed and confused. When I told him what had happened, his face went pale. The Martin girl? he whispered. That cabin? My grandfather built it for the Martin family. Their daughter, she died in there. Hypothermia. Winter of '38. They found her, frozen solid, sitting at the window, like she was waiting for someone to find her. I quit my contract that day. I drove 12 hours straight to get back to my apartment in Columbus, and I didn't stop shaking until I'd been home for a week. The thing that haunts me most isn't the breath, or the words, or even the ghost of a girl who froze to death 80 years ago in the exact spot where I slept. It's the message itself. Stay warm. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a warning. Like whatever remained of that girl was trying to protect me from the same fate that had claimed her. And that, somehow, is worse, because it means she's aware. She remembers. And she's still there, in that cabin, pressing her face against the glass and watching, waiting for the next person who doesn't stay warm enough. The thing about old Appalachian cabins is that they all have crawl spaces. This is a simple architectural fact, a necessity of building on uneven mountain terrain. The structures are raised on stone foundations, leaving a gap of 2 to 3 feet between the floor and the earth below, space for ventilation, for accessing pipes, for keeping the wood dry and rot-free. I knew this intellectually when I bought my cabin in Wise County, Virginia, in the spring of 2020. I understood it as a feature, not a flaw. I didn't understand what else could fit in that space. The cabin was a foreclosure, which should have been my first warning. I bought it for a fraction of its value from a bank that seemed almost eager to be rid of it. The previous owner, a man named Delbert Crumb, had simply disappeared one winter, leaving behind all his possessions and a significant amount of debt. The bank had waited the legally required period, declared him presumed dead, and put the property up for auction. I was the only bidder. The first 6 months were everything I'd hoped for. I worked remotely as a software developer, spent my evenings hiking the trails behind my property, and fell asleep each night to the sound of absolute, perfect silence. I renovated the kitchen, replaced the roof, and generally made the cabin my own. I thought I'd found my forever home. The sounds began in November, shortly after the first frost. It started as scratching, faint, rhythmic scratching from beneath the floorboards of my bedroom, usually beginning around midnight and continuing until just before dawn. I assumed it was an animal, a groundhog or possum that had made its home in the crawl space. I bought traps, set them at the access point behind the cabin, and waited. The traps were never triggered, but the scratching continued. Worse, it began to change. What had started as random, animalistic noise became deliberate, patterned, almost purposeful. 3 scratches, a pause, then 2 more. 3 and 2. 3 and 2. Over and over again, night after night. I finally worked up the courage to investigate the crawl space myself. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I opened the wooden access panel and peered into the darkness beneath my home. The space was exactly as I expected. Dirt, floor, stone foundation walls, wooden beams supporting the structure above. Empty. No animals, no nests, no explanation for the sounds I'd been hearing. I sealed the access panel with new lumber and heavy-duty screws. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It was 3 weeks before I discovered the second access point. I was cleaning the cabin for the holidays, moving furniture I hadn't touched since I'd moved in, when I found it. A small trapdoor, cut into the floor of the back corner of my bedroom, hidden beneath a heavy dresser that must have been Delbert Crumb's The trapdoor was secured with a padlock that looked newer than anything else in the cabin. I broke the lock with a crowbar. The trapdoor opened onto the same crawl space I'd inspected before, but from this angle, I could see something I'd missed. At the far end of the space, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, was a hole in the earth. Not a natural depression, but a rectangular pit, approximately 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, that had been dug deliberately into the ground. Beneath my home, the dimensions of a grave. I didn't go down there. I couldn't. Instead, I called the county sheriff, explained what I'd found, and waited on my front porch while they investigated. They found Delbert Crumb's remains buried in that pit, wrapped in plastic sheeting and covered with lime. He'd been dead for at least 2 years, probably killed shortly after the last time anyone had seen him alive. The investigation determined that he'd been murdered, but they never found the killer. The theory was that someone, perhaps a transient, perhaps someone Delbert had known, had killed him and hidden the body in the crawl space, then simply walked away. But that theory doesn't explain the scratching. I sold the cabin as soon as the investigation closed, taking a massive loss just to be free of it. I've never told anyone the whole truth about what I heard beneath those floorboards. The patterns, the deliberate rhythm, the unmistakable sense of intention behind the sounds. Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Delbert Crumb had been dead and buried in that crawl space for 2 years before I moved in. Dead and buried beneath lime and plastic, sealed in a grave of cold Virginia earth. So what was scratching beneath my bedroom floor? And why did it only start when I arrived? There's a stretch of Appalachian Trail in Tennessee, near the Great Smoky Mountains, where the forest grows so thick that midday feels like dusk. I hiked that section in February of 2018 during a solo through hike that I'd been planning for years. I was experienced, well-equipped, and confident in my abilities. I had no reason to be afraid. The encounter happened on my 3rd day in the Smokies, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead and 15 from any form of civilization. The temperature had been hovering around 20 degrees, and I was pushing hard to reach a backcountry shelter before nightfall. The trail followed a ridgeline that afternoon, offering occasional glimpses of the valleys below through gaps in the bare winter trees. It was during one of these glimpses that I saw her. She was standing in a clearing about 200 feet below my position, partially hidden by the underbrush, but clearly visible against the snow. A woman in a white dress, completely inappropriate for the weather, with long dark hair that hung past her shoulders. She was facing my direction, though at that distance I couldn't make out her features. Then she raised her arm and waved. It was a slow wave, deliberate and sustained, her arm moving back and forth in a wide arc. The kind of wave you might use to signal someone from far away, to catch their attention and draw them closer. My first thought was that she was in trouble, lost, injured, hypothermic, her mind addled by the cold. I called out to her, my voice echoing through the valley. "Hello, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She just kept waving. I started down the slope, pushing through dead branches and frozen brush, moving as quickly as I could while maintaining my footing. The terrain was treacherous, steep, and covered in ice, and I had to move carefully to avoid a fall that could leave me injured and stranded. It took me nearly 15 minutes to reach the clearing where she'd been standing. She was gone. I searched the area thoroughly, calling out, looking for footprints or any sign of her passage. The snow in the clearing was undisturbed. No footprints, leading in or out. No indication that anyone had ever stood there at all. I told myself she'd moved on while I was descending. I told myself the dense forest had hidden her tracks. I told myself 100 rational explanations and believed none of them. I returned to the trail and continued toward the shelter, moving faster now, driven by an urgency I couldn't quite explain. I reached the shelter at dusk and found it occupied by another hiker, an older man named Carl, who was section hiking the same stretch. Over dinner, I told him about the woman in the white dress. I watched his face change as I spoke, watched the color drain from his weathered cheeks. "Where exactly did you see her?" he asked. I described the location as precisely as I could. Carl was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "That's Mullins Hollow," he finally said. "I grew up about 20 miles from here." We all knew about Mullins Hollow. He told me the story then, speaking slowly, reluctantly, as though the words themselves carried weight. In 1947, a young woman named Eliza Mullins had lived in that hollow with her husband and infant daughter. Her husband had been a drunk and a violent man, and one winter night he'd beaten her unconscious and left her in the snow to die. She'd frozen to death in her nightgown, still reaching toward the cabin where her daughter cried for her. "They say she waves to hikers," Carl said, "trying to get someone to come down and help her. She's been doing it for 70 years. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the wooden ceiling of the shelter, thinking about that slow, deliberate wave. The way she'd faced exactly my direction. The way she'd kept wavering even as I called out to her." Carl and I hiked out together the next morning. As we passed the ridge above Mullins Hollow, I refused to look down into the valley. But Carl did. I heard him stop behind me, heard his sharp intake of breath. "Don't look," he said quietly. "Just keep walking." I kept walking, but in the corner of my eye, at the very edge of my peripheral vision, I saw a flash of white among the winter trees, and I heard something that might have been the wind through the branches, or might have been a voice, faint and distant, calling for help that would never come. My father died in September of 2022, and I inherited his cabin in the mountains of West Virginia along with everything in it. The cabin had been in our family for 4 generations, built by my great-great-grandfather in 1891 and passed down through the firstborn sons ever since. My father had lived there alone for the last decade of his life, growing increasingly reclusive and strange as the years went by. We'd spoken perhaps twice in the 3 years before his death, brief and uncomfortable conversations that never touched on anything meaningful. The lawyer who handled the estate warned me that the cabin was in poor condition, that my father had let things go toward the end. I drove up from Charlotte expecting to find amaze dishes in the sink, trash piled in corners, the general decay of a man who'd stopped caring about his surroundings. What I found was much worse. The cabin was immaculate. Obsessively so. Every surface was clean, every item was in its place, every window was sealed with plastic sheeting and duct tape. The furniture had been pushed against the walls, leaving the center of each room completely empty, and covering every inch of wall space, from floor to ceiling, were handwritten notes. The notes were my father's handwriting, sprawling and increasingly erratic as they climbed the walls. They all said variations of the same thing. "Don't listen. It's not real. Cover your ears. The recordings lie." I found the tape recorder in his bedroom, an ancient Sony cassette player that must have been older than me. Beside it was a stack of cassette tapes, perhaps 30 in total, each labeled with a date spanning the last 2 years of my father's life. I loaded the oldest tape into the player and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like voices. Distant, distorted, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. The longer I listened, the clearer they became. They were calling my father's name. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was audio pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful sounds in random noise. I told myself my father had been mentally ill, that the notes on the walls were evidence of paranoid delusions. I told myself there was a rational explanation for everything. Then I played the next tape. The voices were clearer on this one. Multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in a strange sing-song cadence that made the hair on my arms stand up. They were saying my father's name over and over, interspersed with other words I couldn't quite understand. The recording quality was poor, but the intent was unmistakable. Something was calling to him. Sudney was trying to get his attention. I played tape after tape, watching the dates progress, listening as the voices grew louder and more distinct with each recording. By the final tapes, they weren't just saying my father's name. They were speaking in full sentences, telling him things, promising him things, asking him to come outside, to open the door, to let them in. And then I heard something that made me drop the recorder. On the final tape, dated 2 days before my father's death, the voices stopped calling his name. They started calling mine. I burned the tapes that night, all of them, in a bonfire behind the cabin. I tore the notes off the walls and burned those too. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the silence, terrified that I would hear voices in it. The cabin is still in my name. I've never been back. I pay a local handyman to check on it once a month, and his reports are always the same. Everything is fine, nothing out of the ordinary, just an empty cabin in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about those recordings. I wonder what my father heard in the static. I wonder if the voices are still there, waiting in the empty rooms, calling a name that no one is left to hear. And I wonder if I went back, if I sat in that cabin in the dark and listened, whether they would start calling for me again. I've saved this story for last because it's the one I understand the least. The one that still keeps me awake on cold winter nights when the wind is quiet and the darkness feels too deep. It happened in January of 2023, at a cabin I rented in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, and it changed the way I think about the nature of reality itself. The cabin was remote, accessible only by a 4-mile hike from the nearest road, which is exactly why I'd chosen it. I was a writer at the time, working on a novel that required isolation and concentration. And I'd rented the property for 3 months, specifically to escape the distractions of modern life. No internet, no cell service, no electricity beyond what a small solar panel could provide. Just me, my typewriter, and the endless Appalachian wilderness. The first month was productive. I wrote 30,000 words, fell into a rhythm of work and rest, and grew to love the profound silence of the mountains. The second month brought snow, and with it, a deeper isolation that I found almost meditative. I was alone in a way that few modern humans ever experience, and I cherished it. The problem began in the third month, on a night so cold that the inside of my windows frosted over. I was typing by candlelight when I noticed something through the frost. A light in the forest, perhaps a 1/4 mile from my cabin, flickering between the trees. My first thought was that someone else was out there, another cabin I hadn't known. About another person seeking the same solitude I'd found, but I'd explored the area extensively, and I knew for certain that there were no other structures within 5 miles. The forest in that direction was nothing but trees, rocks, and ancient, untouched wilderness. I watched the light for several minutes. It was steady, warm, the distinctive glow of firelight or candlelight rather than the harsh white of a flashlight or lantern. It seemed to pulse slightly, growing brighter and dimmer in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, against every instinct telling me to stay inside. I bundled up and went out to investigate. The walk through the snow was difficult, and by the time I reached the area where I'd seen the light, I was exhausted and freezing. But there was nothing there. No cabin, no campfire, no explanation for what I'd seen. Just dark trees and deeper darkness beyond them. I returned to my cabin, convinced I'd imagined it. But the next night, the light was back, and the next, and every night that followed, always in the same location, always with that same warm, steady glow. On the 5th night, I noticed something that filled me with a cold far deeper than any winter could produce. The light had moved closer. Not by much, perhaps 50 feet nearer to my cabin than it had been the night before. But it had definitely moved. After that, it moved every night. 50 feet closer, then another 50, then 100. I stopped going outside. I started keeping my windows covered. I wrote feverishly during the day and huddled in terror at night, listening for sounds that never came. On my final night in that cabin, the light reached my yard. I didn't look at it directly. I couldn't. Some primal part of my brain, the part that knew things my conscious mind refused to accept, warned me that looking would be the end of everything. But I could see it through the gaps in my window coverings, that warm, steady glow, pulsing just feet from my cabin walls. And then I heard the knock, not on my door, but from inside the window, as though whatever was producing the light was already somehow inside, looking out, watching me the way I'd been watching it. I fled that night, leaving everything behind. I hiked for miles through waist-deep snow in the pitch darkness, nearly dying of exposure before I reached my car. I never went back for my belongings, my typewriter, or the manuscript I'd been working on. But here's the thing that truly haunts me, the detail that transforms this story from strange to truly disturbing. When I think back on those nights, when I force myself to remember exactly what I saw, I realize that the light wasn't just moving toward my cabin, it was moving from my cabin, outward into the forest. Every night, it started at my window and traveled away, deeper into the wilderness, before returning the following evening. The light wasn't approaching my cabin. It was leaving it. Every night, something left my cabin while I slept, traveled out into the forest, and returned before dawn. Something that glowed with that warm, steady light. Something that knocked on the window from the inside. And I have to wonder now, in the dark hours when sleep won't come. During those months of isolation, during those long nights when I thought I was alone in that cabin, what was in there with me? What was sleeping beside me in the darkness, waiting for me to drift off before it began its nightly journey into the woods? And where, exactly, was it going? I need to tell you about the mirror, though even now, 3 years later, my hands tremble when I try to put the experience into words. It happened during the winter of 2020 at a rental cabin in the Nantahala National Forest of North Carolina. And it shattered everything I thought I knew about the nature of what we see when we look at ourselves. The cabin belonged to a company that specialized in digital detox, retreats, shroomed properties with no Wi-Fi, no television, no connection to the outside world. I'd booked it for 2 weeks following a mental breakdown that had cost me my job, my relationship, and very nearly my life. My therapist had suggested isolation as a way to reconnect with myself, to strip away the noise and find whatever remained underneath. Looking back now, I wonder if she understood how literally that suggestion would manifest. The property was beautiful in the stark, skeletal way that winter forests can be beautiful. The cabin itself was a converted hunting lodge, larger than I'd expected, with a great room dominated by a stone fireplace and a bedroom that faced east toward the rising sun. The furnishings were rustic but comfortable, all rough-hewn wool blankets, with one exception that caught my attention immediately upon arrival. In the corner of the great room stood a full-length mirror in an ornate, gilded frame, clearly antique, completely out of place among the cabin's deliberately simple aesthetic. The glass was old enough to have developed a slight warp, and when I looked into it, my reflection seemed subtly wrong in a way I couldn't quite identify. I assumed it was the distortion of age, the imperfection of 19th century glasswork. I was wrong. The first 3 days passed peacefully. I slept late, took long walks through the frozen forest, and spent my evenings reading by firelight. The silence was profound, almost overwhelming, but I grew to appreciate it. I began to feel, for the first time in months, something approaching peace. On the 4th night, I noticed the discrepancy. I was preparing for bed, walking past the mirror. On my way to the bedroom, when I caught my reflection in my peripheral vision, I stopped, turned, and looked directly at the glass. My reflection looked back. Everything seemed normal, same clothes, same posture, same exhausted face I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Then, I raised my right hand to brush hair from my face. My reflection raised its left. I froze, my hand still touching my cheek, staring at the figure in the mirror. It stared back, perfectly still, its left hand pressed against its own face in a perfect mirror reversal of my position. But mirrors don't work that way. When you raise your right hand, your reflection raises what appears to be its right hand. It's the reversal of the image itself, not the action. What I was seeing was impossible, as though the figure in the mirror was not a reflection at all but another person, copying my movements from the other side of the glass. I stepped back. The reflection stepped back. I stepped forward. The reflection stepped forward. I waved my right hand. The reflection waved its left. I ran to the bedroom and didn't sleep until dawn. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Exhaustion, isolation, the lingering effects of my breakdown, any of these could explain a momentary visual hallucination. I avoided looking at the mirror for the rest of the day, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor whenever I passed it. That night, I couldn't resist. I had to know. I stood before the mirror and performed a simple test. I held up 3 fingers on my right hand. The reflection held up 3 fingers on its left hand. I touched my right ear. The reflection touched its left ear. The reversal was consistent, undeniable, impossible. And then the reflection did something I hadn't done at all. It smiled, not a warm smile, not a friendly expression, a slow, deliberate curving of the lips that seemed to contain knowledge I couldn't access, amusement at a joke I wasn't part of. I watched in paralyzed horror as my own face smiled back at me with an expression I had never worn, would never wear, couldn't even imagine myself making. I tore the mirror from the wall that night and carried it outside. I wanted to smash it, to shatter the glass into 1,000 pieces and scatter them in the forest. But something stopped me. Some superstition I didn't know I possessed. Some primal fear of what might happen if I broke that glass and released whatever was on the other side. Instead, I turned it to face a tree and left it there, its back to the cabin, its surface reflecting nothing but bark and branches. I didn't look in any reflective surface for the remainder of my stay. Not the windows at night, not the water in my glass, not even the blade of my knife when I cut vegetables for dinner. I kept my eyes averted, my gaze always fixed on something solid, something real, something that couldn't look back. On my final morning, as I packed my car to leave, I made the mistake of glancing toward where I'd left the mirror. It was still there, still facing the tree, exactly as I'd positioned it, but propped against its back, clearly visible from where I stood, was a note written on a piece of paper I recognized as coming from the cabin's welcome packet. The note contained 3 words, written in handwriting that was unmistakably my own. See you soon. I haven't looked in a mirror since. I shaved by touch. I brush my teeth with my eyes closed. I've covered or removed every reflective surface in my home. My friends think I've developed some kind of body dysmorphia, some phobia born from my mental health struggles. But I know the truth. I know that somewhere, in some mirror, in some reflection, another version of me is waiting, watching, smiling that terrible smile. And I know, with absolute certainty, that one day I'll slip. One day I'll glance at a window, catch my reflection in a puddle, look too long at the dark screen of my phone, and when I do, that thing will be there, waiting to show me what happens when the reflection stops copying and starts leading. The exterminator was the one who finally told me the truth, though by then I'd already spent 3 months living with them, hearing their whispers through the timber, feeling their presence in every creak and groan of that ancient cabin. He was an old man named Jasper who'd been working these mountains for 40 years, and when I described what I'd been hearing, his face went the color of ash. "That ain't mice," he said. "That ain't nothing that belongs in this world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, in the autumn of 2019, when I inherited my grandmother's cabin in the hills of southwestern Virginia. She'd passed in her sleep at the age of 93, and I was her only living relative, the sole recipient of her estate, which consisted entirely of that cabin and the 12 acres of forest surrounding it. I'd visited the property only once. As a child, a vague memory of wood smoke and homemade biscuits and a grandmother who seemed as ancient and permanent as the mountains themselves. The cabin was small 2 rooms and a loft built from hand-hewn logs that my great-great-grandfather had cut from the very forest it sat within. The walls were thick, the windows were few, and the ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in. Certain areas, it felt less like a building and more like a cave, a dark space carved from the wilderness itself. I moved in on the 1st of October, planning to winterize the property and decide whether to sell it or keep it as a vacation home. The nearest town was 30 minutes away. The nearest neighbor was a logging operation 2 miles east, and cell service was non-existent. I told myself the isolation would be good for me, a chance to unplug and reconnect with my roots. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. The voices started on my 3rd night. I was lying in bed, drifting toward sleep, when I heard what sounded like whispering coming from the wall beside my head. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech. The rise and fall of human conversation conducted at a volume just below the threshold of comprehension. I pressed my ear against the logs and listened. The whispering stopped. I assumed I'd imagined it a hypnagogic hallucination brought on by exhaustion and unfamiliar sound. I rolled over and went to sleep. The next night, the voices were louder. I could almost make out words now. fragments of conversation that seemed to slip away the moment I tried to focus on them. The timber walls of the cabin created natural acoustics, I reasoned. Perhaps sound was traveling from somewhere else, distorted by distance and wood until it became something unrecognizable. Perhaps there were hikers nearby, their conversation carried on the wind, but the voices weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the walls themselves, from the very logs that formed the structure of the cabin. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon intensified. The whispers became constant, a background murmur that followed me from room to room, that seemed to emanate from whichever wall I was closest to. Sometimes they rose in volume, becoming almost audible, and I would catch what sounded like words, names, dates, fragments of sentences that made no sense out of context. Other times they fell to a bare susurration, like the sound of wind through grass, present but unobtrusive. I began to distinguish individual voices, at least a dozen of them, male and female, old and young, speaking in accents that ranged from modern Appalachian to something older, something that sounded almost colonial. They weren't speaking to me, I was certain of that. They were speaking to each other, carrying on conversations that had nothing to do with my presence, discussions. I could overhear but never quite understand. The exterminator came in early December, summoned to deal with what I assumed was a mouse infestation. I'd been hearing scratching sounds along with the voices, movement within the walls, and I'd convinced myself that the combination was some kind of acoustic trick. Rodent noise distorted into the semblance of speech. Jasper spent an hour inspecting the cabin, checking for entry points, looking for droppings, searching for any sign of animal habitation. He found nothing. No mice, no squirrels, no indication that anything living had ever nested in those walls. "These logs," he said finally, running his hand along the timber. "You know what they're made of?" I didn't understand the question. "Wood," I said. "From the forest." Jasper shook his head slowly. "Chestnut," he said. "American chestnut. Ain't been a living American chestnut in these mountains for 100 years. Not since the blight killed 'em all. These logs are older than you can imagine, cut from trees that were ancient when your great-great-grandfather felled 'em." He paused, his weathered face troubled. "There's stories about chestnut wood," he continued. "Old stories. The Cherokee believed chestnut trees were sacred, that they held the spirits of the ancestors. When the trees died, the spirits didn't leave, they stayed in the wood. And when that wood was used to build homes," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I paid him and he left, declining my offer of coffee, declining even to step fully inside the cabin. His truck had barely disappeared down the mountain road before the voices rose again, louder than ever, dozens of them now, speaking all at once in a cacophony that filled my head and made my teeth vibrate in their sockets. And for the first time, I understood what they were saying. They were telling stories. Stories of lives lived and lost in these mountains. Stories of birth and death, of love and grief, of endless years spent watching the world change while they remained trapped in the wood, waiting, remembering, speaking their histories into the deaf ears of anyone who lived within their walls. I stayed another month, listening. I wrote down what I could understand, filling notebook after notebook with fragments of lives that had ended generations before I was born. A woman who lost 3 children to fever. A man who walked into the forest one winter and never returned. A young couple married beneath the branches of the very trees that now formed my bedroom walls. Their stories became my obsession, my purpose, the reason I stayed in that cabin long after any sane person would have fled. Then, On the winter solstice, the voices changed. They stopped telling their own stories and started telling mine. Spoke of things I'd done, things I'd thought, things I'd never told anyone. They knew my secrets, my shames, the dark corners of my soul I'd hidden even from myself. They spoke my history back to me in a chorus of dead voices, and I understood then what they were doing. They were making a place for me. They were adding my story to theirs, preparing to hold me in the wood the way they held all the others. I burned the cabin that night. I stood in the snow and watched it blaze, watched the ancient chestnut logs crack and split and release plumes of smoke that rose toward the winter stars. I told myself I was freeing them, releasing the spirits that had been trapped for so long. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the timber frame of my apartment building. I hear voices in the wooden beams of my office. I hear them everywhere what exists, everywhere trees once grew and were cut and were shaped into the structures that shelter us. And I know now that you can't destroy wood by burning it. You just change its form. You release it into the air, into the smoke, into the very atmosphere we breathe. The voices didn't die in that fire. They just spread.